Good. Shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, are you able to hear me? It looks as though you are. Your reaction is encouraging. Great. Welcome, everyone. My name's Phil Ziegler. I'm a professor of Christian dogmatics here in the department, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Divinity opening lecture for the 2022-23 academic year. Like New College in Edinburgh and Trinity College in Glasgow, Christ College, the entity which is hosting this event here in Aberdeen, arose out of the Great Disruption of the Kirk in 1843 and the need for the Free Church to provide theological education. In the years since the reunion in 1929, Christ College and the continuing divinity faculty of this university were reintegrated, eventually coming to be housed here in Old Aberdeen after the sale of the Christ College buildings on Offord Place in the center of town. You can still visit them if you like. If you do that, you'll find a Free Presbyterian church, the college bar, and a club called Babylon. Yeah. At this point in time, the chief role of Christ College is to oversee the preparation and the formation of ministerial candidates for the Church of Scotland. In this, the college works very closely with the department, supporting posts in the field of practical theology and the work of the Aberdeen Centre for Ministry Studies, hosting lectures and special events like this one here today, funding various academic prizes and awards, and maintaining the Divinity Library here in King's College, to which we will all repair for refreshments after the lecture is completed. Our illustrious colleague, the Reverend Professor John Swinton, Fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, chaplain and member of the monarch's ecclesiastical household, no less, is the current master of Christ College. He is also not here. John's labors have taken him to Australia and now, it seems, to Denmark. And so we are sorry for his absence, but we look forward to his safe return. Now, someone who is here, however, is Professor Paul Nimmo. Paul is our head of department, and I'd invite Paul to come forward just now to offer you some words of welcome. Paul.
Thank you very much, Phil. It gives me great pleasure to be here with you today and to be able to add my own welcome to you as head of department to this new academic year in Divinity. This is a wonderful time for us here in this department. Our faculty are growing in number and in diversity. Our recent ref result puts us at #1 in the whole country for the research undertaken here. Our student satisfaction at undergraduate level continues to be among the highest in the country, regularly hitting 100%. And in the midst of all that, we remain a genuine community, marked by our collegiality and the care that we have for each other, staff and students. So this is an exciting place at an exciting time. And the fact that we are here with such an optimistic outlook and so much to look forward to is not a matter of chance, although it might technically be a matter of divine providence. It's also a matter of significant amounts of hard work. And although I stand before you as head of department, I am only recently installed as such. And much of the wonder of our current position is due to the incredible efforts of our previous head of department, who has steered us to this point, Professor Tom Greggs. Tom has been our glorious leader for 3.5 years, and I confess that when he was appointed, a number of staff had a sweepstake as to how long it would be before the troubles with the administration and the vexations with colleagues would lead Tom to go postal one Friday afternoon, potentially smashing windows and kicking in filing cabinets. Sadly, our hopes for such drama were disappointed. Tom instead demonstrated the patience of a saint at regular intervals and led us with passion, energy, wisdom, and insight at great cost to his own research. Tom, we are all in this department indebted to you for your leadership throughout these recent seasons. And I wonder if you might come forward and receive a small token of our appreciation. So the first thing, Tom, is a card for you from the department. The second thing, I suspect the time for drowning your sorrows is past. But hopefully you can celebrate a rosy future. And lastly, in case you need to remember the scene of so many triumphs and traumas, we have here a picture of our very own King's College. It remains for me, on behalf of the faculty of the department, simply to encourage you not to be strangers to us, to reach out to us, to help us build the community that this department represents, and finally to wish you every blessing in the academic year ahead.
So our opening lecture today is given by the Reverend Professor John Behr, Regis Chair of Humanity here at the University of Aberdeen. John was appointed by the Queen to his prestigious Regis Professorship in 2020, and so he joined the department during those most disrupted and dispiriting days of the recent pandemic. After earning his doctorate from Oxford University under the supervision of Metropolitan Callistus Ware, now of blessed memory, he taught with distinction for some 25 years at St. Vladimir's Seminary in New York City. John is a world-renowned scholar of early Christian literature and theology. His work is wide-ranging, encompassing, on the one hand, the detailed manuscript and painstaking philological labor involved in producing critical editions of texts by the likes of Diodore of Tarsus, Theodore of Mopsuesta, Teddy the Mop to you, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Irenaeus. And on the other hand, commanding synthetic and conceptual efforts of the sort that we find displayed in his comprehensive interpretation of the formation of early Christian theology in a series of books which many of you will know, and his more constructive theological writing, including his quite recent John the Theologian and his Paschal Gospel, a prologue to theology from 2019. John will speak to us today on the theme, The Word at Play, Providence and Pedagogy. I invite you to join me in welcoming John to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you for the words of introduction and for everybody being here. It really is wonderful to see everybody. 2.5 years into COVID, arriving here has been quite an experience, but it really is truly wonderful to see everybody. So, the Word on high plays in all sorts of forms, mingling with his world here and there as he so desires. Those are words from a poem of Gregor Nazianzus in the 4th century, and they were commented on by Maximus Confessor some 3 centuries later in the 7th century. Maximus had been a civil servant and an aide to Emperor Heraclius, but had given up the life of the court to embrace a piece of the monastic life, only to be embroiled in all sorts of controversies thereafter. But more importantly, he stands at a turning point in the history of theology in the East, between the golden age of patristic literature in the 4th and 5th century and the subsequent world of Byzantine theology. And this transition is seen most clearly in his works entitled Peri Diaphoron Aporon, or in Latin, The Ambigua, and in a recent English translation, On Various Difficulties. In fact, it's 2 books, The Ambigua, or Difficulties for John, and The Ambigua to Thomas. The Ambigua to John was written between 628 and 630, after Maximus had settled in North Africa, but it picks up on a conversation that he had had several years earlier with John of Cyzicus in Asia Minor. John had then written to Maximus asking for a written version, he says, of the interpretations of the passages that perplexed us in the orations of St. Gregory the theologian, Greg of Nazianzus, which we had labored over when we were together. Maximus replied with a treatise dealing with 66 passages of Gregory, and then a few years later he wrote another set of difficulties, the Ambigua to Thomas, dealing with 4 passages from Gregory and 1 from Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius. Although written later, it would seem that Maximus was the one who brought the 2 works together, placing the works to Thomas first, and that's how we know them. Now, this work of Maximus is really something of a novelty in early Christian writing. It marks a moment at which passages from earlier writers become themselves a subject for further reflection. Scholia, short notes, annotations, had previously been composed, such as those by John of Scythopolis, also on Dionysius the Areopagite in the 6th century. But Maximus's texts on difficult passages in Gregory were much more comprehensive and quite different. The texts of Gregory provided Maximus with occasions for expounding a comprehensive vision of theology, cosmology, and anthropology. The Christian theological tradition had virtually from the beginning, and certainly self-consciously so from the time of Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, it had been concerned to preserve the apostolic deposit. From the late 4th century, theologians have sought to demonstrate this continuity by drawing up lists of passages, florilegia, from earlier writers, confirming the various positions in the controversies of their own day. But with Maximus, something new happens. The text of earlier writers now become a springboard for further exposition, and creatively so. Maximus's treatises are not narrow historical or philological exposition of Gregory's texts, although he doesn't overlook those dimensions. Rather, he seeks to aid his reader in acquiring a deeper understanding in their own present. Moreover, in doing so, Maximus is alive to the possibility of different interpretations. Actually, in responding to the difficult passages in Gregory that were asked about by John and Thomas, he often gives alternative interpretations, a number of different theoria, a number of different contemplations of the same text. So what he's doing is not elaborating a fixed or rigid theological schema, but rather offering alternatives which he hopes may resolve the perplexity of John and Thomas. Indeed, the very last difficulty, Ambiguum number 71, which is devoted to the lines of Gregory with which I began, the word on high plays in all sorts of forms. For that text, Maximus offers no less than 4 different interpretations. So Maximus is being as playful as the word is also playful. And this, I suggest, is the hermeneutical guide for reading his work as a whole. So the word on high plays in all sorts of forms, mingling with his world here and there as he so desires. Now, those words might strike us today as being somewhat trivializing the world and our existence and our struggles within the world as nothing more than a game or a play. But as Hugo Rana and Walter Ong point out, there is in fact nothing more godly and more human than play. Whereas for us today, freedom tends to be a cause for which we fight, a serious matter. Really, the world of play is the world of freedom, of spontaneity, of activity for its own sake, of pure realization. Likewise, whereas we today might think of play as being opposite to work, in fact, that really only holds at the lower, more mundane levels. The best players of a game are the professionals, those for whom it is work. And in turn, the best workers are those for whom it is a kind of play. Think about the mechanic who tinkers, the financier who plays the market, the philosopher who plays with ideas. Play is also, of course, imitation, learning how to grow into the realization of possibilities through mimesis, imitation. Children play at adult life. Adults learn through imitation to enter what is real. And in theology, the sheer graciousness of the diffusiveness of God in and through creation can be seen as God's play, freely and spontaneously, playfully giving existence to creation. A play that's also a pedagogy, enabling human beings to grow into that playful life of God. It's really no accident that throughout the centuries, our lost condition is thought of as having been childlike. And to return to that condition, to enter into the kingdom, to come to God, requires, as Christ says, becoming like little children. Now, intimations of this, echoes of which we hear in Gregory's words, are found throughout the ancient world. According to Heraclitus, he says, the aeon is a child at play, moving pieces in a game. The kingdom is a child's. It's not clear really what the word aeon in that refers to. That fragment's quoted by Hippolytus, who introduces it with the words, the totality, topan, is a child. And throughout eternity, the eternal king of all things is, followed by the quotation of Heraclius, the eternal king of all things is the aeon as a child at play. So the aeon is both at once a king and a child, with the power of the former, but with the light-heartedness of the latter, moving pieces around in a game. The work is royal, and therefore meaningful and powerful, but also childlike, free from care, spontaneous. And that's a dialectical paradox, perhaps even anticipating expressing some kind of metaphysics of creation, not as a closed, inexorable system, mechanically obeying its own laws, but as a graceful game, the play of the aeon. Plato also spoke of divine play in his work, The Laws, Book 7. Like a shipbuilder, he says, a shipbuilder who by laying down the line of the keel draws the whole ship in outline. So also, the Athenian, one of the people in the dialogue, seeks to consider what it means and in what ways we are to go through life best, through the voyage of life, like the ship. And the Athenian concludes, he says, serious things must be treated seriously, but not those that are not serious. And it is God who is indeed and truth, worthy of our most serious and blessed endeavors. For the human being is, as I said before, the plaything of God, theou ti pagnion, the plaything of God. And this truly considered as the best about him. Everyone, therefore, whether man or woman, must pass through life in accordance with his character, playing the noblest of games, being otherwise minded than they are now. The dialogue continues. Rather than devoting ourselves to what we might think of as being a serious endeavor, such as war, as the Spartans would do, claiming that war is necessary for peace, the Athenian responds by saying we should live out our lives playing at certain pastimes, sacrificing, singing, and dancing, so as to win heaven's favor and repel our foes. This is a serious game, the most serious. Following the advice of the goddess Athena to Telemachus, the Athenian then adds, the heavenly powers will suggest to them everything that concerns sacrifice and the dance, in honor of what gods and at what seasons they are to play and win their favor. And thus they are to mold their lives according to the shape of their nature, inasmuch as they are for the most parts puppets, having but little share of the truth. Interestingly, that word puppet is thavmata, from the word thavma, which primarily means wonder, marvel, or in a Christian context, miracle. but is used derivatively to express a puppet show and thereby puppets. The person in the dialogue, the Spartan Megilos, then objects to this description, saying that it's a really mean and low view of human beings. And the Athenian then responds, "Marvel not, Megillus, but forgive me. For when I spoke thus, I had my mind set on God and was feeling the emotion to which I gave utterance. Let us grant, however, if you wish, that the human race is not a mean thing, but worthy of serious attention." So puppets being played. Now it's easy to mishear the intent of Plato's words. Rather than denying any reality, dignity, seriousness, or responsibility to human existence, actions, and affairs, Plato's point, as Rana notes, is that anyone who is truly in earnest about God will not be able to treat the human being as though the whole meaning of all created things were comprised in him. And only the human being who has grasped this transcendence, inscribed into the very essence of participated created being, only such a one can truly play. For they have laid hold of the mean between gravity and fun, between the tragedy of existence and the light-hearted surrender to the game of life, which is mysteriously guided by the goodness of a wisdom also at play. A couple more examples. Plotinus takes up this imagery, and he sees it in the grandest scale altogether. He says, "The life of the universe in its multiplicity produces all things, and in its living variegates them and never ceases making beautiful and shapely living playthings." Proclus likewise, in his commentary on the Timaeus, Proclus also uses the imagery of play. He says, "Others also say that he who fashioned the world was playing a game in the shaping of his cosmos, as Heraclitus already declared." And then finally, Plotinus also extends this playfulness to his own work, just as I think Maximus is doing. Plotinus begins his treatise on nature, contemplation, and the one with these cautionary but playful words. He starts off this treatise by saying, "If before attempting to be serious, we were actually to begin by playing, and say that all things aim at contemplation and look to this goal, not only rational but also non-rational animals, would anyone put up with the oddity of the statement? In fact, when the issue has been raised amongst ourselves, there will be no harm in playing with what is ours." And then he concludes this opening by saying, "Are we too then contemplating right now when we are playing?" He's being playful with his reader as he's writing this playful treatise. Now, what makes all of these intimations of the play of God, and there are many, many others, what makes them more than the playfulness of pagan philosophy or myth makers is a striking passage in Proverbs 8, which really lay at the heart of all theological reflection in the early centuries. Proverbs 8:22-25, where wisdom says of herself that she was created the beginning of the ways of God, before the hills he begets me, that provided material for distinguishing between creating and begetting and was at the heart of the debate in the 4th century. But it really is the following verses that are more striking and open up a broader vision. So from verse 27-31, it says, Wisdom says, "When he prepared the heavens, I was present with him. When he made strong the foundation of the earth, I was beside him like a little child. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the sons of men." That word in verse 29, like a little child, is in fact unclear. The word only occurs in this place. The RSV opts for the translation, like a master workman, but it notes that like a little child is an alternative. However, the word used for the rejoicing of wisdom before the face of God, that word is used twice elsewhere in the scriptures, in 2 Samuel, where it speaks of David as making merry or dancing before the Lord. And reinforcing this is a Septuagint translation which has paisontes, to play like a little child, or I will play like a child and I will dance. The Septuagint, instead of having like a little child in that verse from Proverbs, opts for like a master workman. Opts for pa aftor amouzosa. I was beside him, fitting together, or creating alongside him, in harmony with him. The harmony that accompanies God's work of creation. And in the final verse, instead of having rejoicing in the inhabited world, the Septuagint has, when he rejoiced after completing the world, or after completing his work upon the world. So a vision opens up in this passage of wisdom as a child of God, playing and dancing before the face of God in the creation of the world, harmonizing it and completing the inhabited world, that in which God delights and rejoices. We already see some reflection on this in Origen. In one of his works, he says, "This is that very wisdom of God, in whom God always delighted when the world was finished, that by this God might be understood to rejoice always. In this wisdom, therefore, who was ever with the Father, was creation always delineated and shaped, and there was never a moment when the prefiguration of those things which were to be thereafter was not already in wisdom." So the delight of the Father in his Son overflows upon the world in all its variegated beauty, which is itself prefigured in wisdom, herself dancing and playing before God. The variation eternally immanent within wisdom is, as it were, externalized in creation, guided by the same dance, in and through which God's designs are worked out. In a passage from Gregory, going back to Gregory, in a passage from Gregory, similar to the lines with which I began, but in another poem, Gregory uses the same language to describe the playing out of God's work. After speaking about all the variation within creation, which he affirms is not a matter of necessity or of blind chance, yet the coherence of which, the way in which it all holds together as one creation, is beyond our understanding, Gregory then comments, "But this much I do know. It is God who steers the course of the universe, the word of God guiding here and there what his designs have placed below and above. To the world above he's granted concord and a fixed course lasting firm forever. To the lower world he's assigned a life of change which involves many varying forms." So guiding this world above and below, here and there, entha ke entha, matching the mingling of the word here and there in the verse with which I began. The heavens are stable in their movements. The world below, and indeed our lives within it, involve many and continually changing forms, the flux of Heraclitus. So that's a background for Gregory's lines. His lines, "The word on high plays in all sorts of forms, mingling with his world here and there as he so desires." As I've already mentioned, Maximus gives us 4 different interpretations of this passage. The first is made by reference to Psalm 41, 42, Septuagint numbering, where it says, "My soul was troubled at myself. Therefore I shall remember you from a land of Jordan and Hermon, from a small mountain, deep calls to deep at the sound of your cataracts." Psalm 41. When David says, "deep calls to deep at the sound of your cataracts," Maximus playfully takes the word deep, avisos, as referring to the mind, nous, for who comprehends their own mind, which when it is opened, is able to penetrate beyond the realm of sense perception and begin to understand the depth of the intelligible realm that the world embodies. The sound of the cataracts, the voice, the phonie of the rushing or descending waters, think of a waterfall, this he takes as referring to the principles and modes of divine providence governing the universe. Understanding these principles or modes governing the universe, he says, is a gift. And this gift enables us to remember God from the land of Jordan and Hermon. Why this place? Well, as Maximus reminds us, this place is, as he puts it, where the great and awesome mystery of the descent of the Word of God was accomplished through the flesh. A mystery which in the truth of right faith in God was given to human beings, and which insofar as it utterly transcends the whole order and power of nature, was called the foolishness and weakness of God by the divine Paul, who is both an initiate and initiates others in the divine and secretly known wisdom. So it's his foolishness and weakness, the proclamation of the gospel, that Gregory is referring to, according to Maximus, when he speaks of the word at play. Now, the basis for that association, Maximus explains, is that foolishness and weakness, or childish play, are for us privations. Foolishness is a privation of wisdom, weakness a privation of power, childish play a privation of prudence. But in the case of God, they are not an indication of privation, but God's surpassing wisdom, power, and prudence. Maximus is drawing upon the dialectic from Dionysius of affirmation and denial, apophatic and cataphatic, as elaborated by Dionysius, who had also taken Paul's words about the foolishness and weakness of God as this invitation to a radical inversion, lifting finite minds to ineffable truth. And so countering any attempt to read the language of Scripture, which veils the mystery of God in a superficial manner. As such, the foolishness and weakness of God in Paul's words and the game of God in Gregory's words signify for Maximus, as he says, the mystery of the divine incarnation, since in a manner beyond being it transcends the whole order and arrangement of every nature, possession, power, and activity. And it was this very mystery that the most divine David beheld in his intellect, his nous, from afar, the sound of the cataracts. So, by reference to this verse from the Psalms, and by Paul's characterization of the gospel, that gospel that Paul proclaims as weakness and foolishness, in this first line of interpretation, Maximus places Gregory's words about the play of the word firmly within the preaching of the gospel, the wisdom and the providence of God revealed in Jesus Christ, the great mystery of the word in flesh. He then concludes by saying that he's interpreted this verse conjecturally, as a preliminary exposition of the passage in question. The second contemplation he then gives, he says, will be similarly conjectural, not categorical. But this time he seems to go further. He repeatedly speaks about how he's going to dare to interpret this way, or make bold to interpret this way. As Paul Blauer suggests, it's as if the interpreter must play along, reciprocating the playfulness of the word, who reveals himself in his elusiveness. This line of interpretation is a bit more complex. He suggests that what Gregory calls the game of God is, in his words, perhaps the projection of the intermediate things, poising them equidistant between the extremities on account of their flowing and pliable state. Or better, on account of its being a flowing that remains ever at rest. And this is a paradox, to behold a state of rest that is forever flowing and being carried away, and a flowing that is unmoved, but which has been providentially designed by God for the betterment of the things that are arranged by him. So now Maximus is playing with Heraclitus' idea of the flux, the world and its history as being a continual flux. But for Maximus, this flux only concerns the intermediate state. That is, the visible, created things that surround us and that constitute human life. The things which are positioned between the reality of what lies ahead, the final goal of creation, and the beginning, the ineffable purpose and plan foreordained by God. Maximus quotes a passage from Ecclesiastes to make this point. It's one of the most striking lines of scripture. In Ecclesiastes it says, "What is this that has come into being? It is the same as that which will come into being. What is this that has been created? It is the same as that which will be created." Notice in that line, the beginning and the end are spoken of. The middle, which passes away, is passed by unmentioned. So rather than resigning oneself to the inherent instability, transitoriness, and impermanence of creation, as Heraclitus and others would do, Maximus, having given his first interpretation, the play of the word in the mystery of the enfleshed word, Maximus can now see this continual flux as being the intermediate between the beginning and the end. And moreover, it is, he says, providentially devised for the betterment of those being guided by him through the economy of God, so that they finally arrive at the end, which is in fact their beginning, in the omniscience of God. The first interpretation given by Maximus, that of the mystery of the word being enfleshed in the land of Jordan and Hermon, thus opens up greater depth in Gregory's words. While the word is at play from on high, in this playing, he's mingling himself with his creation and thereby stabilizing its flux. Not by freezing it at any given moment, for that would be to petrify it, to kill it, but by guiding it to the end that's intended from the beginning. And so incarnation has in fact got a far greater scope than we might have thought. For it is with all of creation that the word is mingled, playing here and there, guiding it towards the end. The word of God, Maximus says in Ambiguum 7, the word of God, he says, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. Universal incarnation. The flux that is inherent in created reality, by being providentially ordered towards the desired outcome, is therefore given rest in the paradox of that stable flux, as Maximus puts it. That the word is playing from on high, yet doing so by mingling with his word below, indicates for Maximus that there is in fact a great chasm separating not only the rich man from Lazarus, he quotes that passage, but separating all that has come into being and which exists in a state of flux from that which is uncreated and at rest. Yet the chasm has been crossed. The word on high is playing here below, mingling. To develop this point, Maximus then quotes a really striking passage from, as he puts it, the daring words of Dionysius. Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote this. He says, "One must make bold to say even this on behalf of truth, that the very author of all things, in the overflow of the yearning of his passionate goodness, literally in the eros of his erotic goodness, is drawn outside of himself in his providential care for everything. Beguiled, as it were, by his own goodness, love, and intense love, by his agape and his eros, he's enticed away from his dwelling place above and beyond all things, condescending to penetrate all things according to an ecstatic and supernatural power by which he can still remain in himself." Maximus likens this divine, erotic, ecstatic, incarnational condescension to the way that parents play with their children, taking part in their games, beguiling their senses, he suggests, with colourful flowers or colourfully dyed clothing, attracting their attention and filling them with amazement. And then he says, perhaps the teacher, Gregory, is saying that God is superior to all by leading us through the nature of visible creation, as it were by a kind of story, seeks to amaze us or to attract our attention, after which he directs us to the contemplation of the more spiritual principles within these things. And then finally, he leads us by the way of theology to the more mystical knowledge of God's self, so far as this is possible. And this is called the playing of God by the divine Gregory, the beguiling and going out of himself by the godly-minded Dionysius. So for all its finitude and flux, its vulnerability and its impermanence, the material and sense-perceptive creation is the very medium by which human beings come to know God, in the game that he's playing with us. It's the spiritual principles, the logi, plural of logos, the logi, which these created things embody, that we come to know through being amazed by their appearances. And then by knowing the principles, the logi of these things, we come to know the logos, who embraces them all as a center of the circle, embraces all the points on the circumference. It radiates all the different points. And in coming to know that center of the circle, the logos who embraces all the different logi, we come in turn to the knowledge of God, to theology. And so in turn, the time of our lives, in the flux of created reality, with all its instability and transitoriness, is a playful pedagogy, a stable flux in the providence of God. That's the second interpretation. If you don't like that, he's got two more. Okay? The third one, he takes the idea of stable flux a little bit further. It's a much shorter contemplation. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's just a short paragraph. He says, perhaps play is also the mutability of the material objects which we hold in our hands, which shift things around and are themselves shifted around in various ways, having no solid foundation save for the first principle, the logos, in accordance with which they both bear up and are borne along. So play in Greek, pherousi ke pheronde. They are borne up actively, but they're borne along passively. Wisely and providentially, they carry us along with them. And whereas it might be thought that they can be controlled by us, they slip through our fingers far more frequently than we control them. And they rather almost repel the desire of those among us who insist on clinging to them. So they neither maintain their hold over us, nor are they held by us, since the only stable characteristic their nature possesses is a state of flux and instability. Perhaps this, I say, was fittingly called God's game by the teacher, seeing that it is through these things that God leads us to what is really real and can never be shaken. So the play this time seems to be that of created reality itself, although creation and incarnation can never be separated. As we've seen, Ambiguum 7, the word of God wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. In that same Ambiguum, number 7, Maximus quotes another passage from Gregory, this time from his Oration on the Poor, where Gregory speaks of the transitory things of this world as being like toy pebbles in child's play. Gregory says this, but it seems to me for this reason, none of the good things of this present life can be relied upon. They are short-lived. The things we see, although made by the creative word and the wisdom that transcends all wisdom, the things we see are always changing, now one way, now another, born upwards, then downwards. That is why it seems we are being played with, thing. Before something can be laid hold of, it escapes our grasp. Yet there's purpose in all of this. For when we reflect on the instability and fickleness of such things, we are led to seek refuge in the enduring things that are to come. So again, the image of the game, in the fickleness and the transitoriness of impermanency in the flux of this world. In the following oration, in the following ambiguum, number 8, Gregory takes further words from the same oration of Gregory. This time, he addresses a question of whether sickness and disease come from God, with Gregory concluding the passage saying, it is not clear so long as matter bears with it chaos as in a flowing stream. And now, attempting to answer what Gregory might have meant by that, Maximus begins by affirming that it is the human propensity for preferring material things, our own bodies themselves, rather than the spiritual beauty they embody. It's that propensity which results in the liability and propensity to every passion, and also the instability and inequality of external and material being, and the capacity and proneness for undergoing change. But then he continues, the reverse side of this is either two possible alternatives, again, many different ways of thinking about these, is either that God subjected humans to the capacity for suffering, corruption, and dissolution for their transgression, but subjected them to corruption in hope, as Paul put it in Romans 8, or that in his full knowledge, he had already fashioned human beings in this way, in the words of Maximus, so that by suffering and experiencing evil on its own, the soul would come to an awareness of itself and its proper dignity, and even gladly embrace detachment with respect to the body. In either case, it is the chaos of the flowing stream of material creation that is the medium through which we are reordered and brought in the end to the condition that God has desired from the beginning. Maximus then concludes that ambiguum number 8 with words echoing the same verse of Gregory that we saw earlier. He says, the change and alteration of the body and of things external are for all human beings one and the same thing, both the bearing up and the being borne along, pherusa ke pheromene, which also knows chaos and conductibility as its only stability and its only security. Just like Jonah plunged in the sea, treated by Maximus in a different text. Just like Jonah plunged in the sea, we are, he says, in the chaos of the present world, bearing up, struggling to keep on top of the water, and being borne along, buffeted by the waves. But buffeted by waves which are, on the other hand, the means by which God reorients his creation to the original good purpose, the safe harbor that's only entered at the end. This tension between bearing up and being borne upon, borne along, points to the metaphysical dialectic between activity and passivity, which really is intrinsic to being created. Passive, being molded in the hands of God, but being called actively to be fashioned. Finally, for his fourth interpretation of Gregory's verse, Maximus turns to the transitory nature of human life. Born like other creatures upon the earth, becoming children, then like fading flowers, he says, our youth withers into the wrinkles of old age, culminating in our death, which is our transition to another life. And so, not without reason, Maximus comments, we are said to be the plaything of God by Gregory. Compared to the archetype of divine and true life to come, our present world is like a child's toy. By imitation, by playing this child's toy, this child's game, we are learning to play in the dance of the word, the wisdom of God, rejoicing like a child before God, rejoicing in his creation. Then Maximus concludes, this is his final lines from the whole text. He concludes with the words from Gregory's funeral ovation for his brother Caesarius. He says, "Such is our life, brothers and sisters. We who only live briefly, a thought of gain played upon the earth. Not having existed, we are brought into being. Having been brought into being, we are dissolved. We are but a dream that doesn't last, a phantom that cannot be grasped." Job 20. "The flight of a bird that passes and is gone." Wisdom 5. "A ship passing through the sea, leaving no trace." Again, Wisdom 5. "Dust and vapor." James 4. "A morning dew." Hosea 13. "A flower that sprouts up and in a moment is withered." Again, Job and other passages. "The days of the human being are like grass. They blossom like the flower of the field," as the divine David aptly said when he reflected upon our weakness. And that's where the text ends. It really is perhaps a somber, melancholy even, note upon which to end, especially if you think that the whole text has been devoted to play. Maximus concludes then with Gregory's lament upon the loss of his brother. All things in this world do, after all, end in death. And so here, quite appropriately, Maximus breaks off. But through his 4 interpretations of Gregory's own word, he has playfully offered, perhaps as a consoling word to Gregory himself, he's playfully offered a way of seeing the Heraclitean flux of creation in its history, our own lives, as being a providential pedagogy, one which extends the mystery of the embodiment of the word from the land of Jordan and Hermon to the whole of creation, and does so through the Heraclitean flux itself, no less. So the play of the word is serious business. But Maximus, by concluding his treatment of 70 difficult passages from Gregory in its Ambigua, concludes with this playful word, showing us also a way in which engaging with the tradition can also be playful, which, I suggest, is something well worth remembering as we begin the new academic year. Thank you.
Very much. We have, I think, a few minutes which we could spend with some conversation with John. If there are questions and things, obviously the conversation can continue for the rest of the afternoon and the evening. But there are questions that people have, and sure John's willing to entertain. Wave your hand.
Brian. Brian.
Thank you, John. Impressively wide-ranging as usual, and very illuminating. And one question it raises for me is, well, I'd like to get your sense from that side of the tradition, what's going on in the Western tradition. And I'm sort of prompted by that discussion around Proverbs 7, which is a kind of
Proverbs 8, yeah. Proverbs 8, the wisdom.
Proverbs 8,
Do you have anything particular in mind?
well, the standard reading in the West is that the way that wisdom inhabits the world is as order. And so the play story that you've told is palpably different from the order story that I think still is one of the dominant root logics of thinking about things like moral order, right? The world is teleologically ordered toward a kind of stufa, a layered ordering, classically in Augustine.
Yeah.
So morality and also materiality is inworded when it is in its proper hierarchy. It's a good.
Yeah, I guess the difference would be a question of teleology, because the way that Maximus is talking about the wisdom of God, or the word of God in this case, playing from above, mingling with his word below, brings order to it, but it's order in the midst of this Heraclean flux. Yeah, and so this Heraclean flux, which was seen, as I mentioned earlier, as the playing of the gods in the different ways that Heraclitus and Plato and others spoke about it. The reality of that movement, that transitoriness, the impermanence of things, the flexibility, the instability of all of that, is seen as this play, this dance in which the word is moving all these different things towards that end which is yet to be achieved. Yeah, so it's not solidifying it in a particular rigid order at any given moment, but rather working through that flux with the end in mind, teleologically.
I guess I'll ask another miserably Protestant question. What is the place of sin on one side and truth on the other in relation to an account of play and even to these sorts of interpretive maneuvers? So, listening to the accounts of the interpretation of the Psalms is obviously a particular mode of interpretation. To what extent does our playfulness fall liable to curiosity in a kind of sinful, what would, from my tradition, be considered to be a sinful vein, a vice rather than a virtue?
I mean, curiosity would always be one of the vices within the ascetic tradition, no doubt about that. But I think what's distinctive about what Maximus is doing here is that it integrates the failing of the child as they're learning to play as part of the game itself, so that it becomes the way of learning to play. Yeah? A newborn child doesn't learn to walk apart from by falling over. Yeah? So in that kind of sense, our response to the game can be sinful, but even that very sinfulness is then kind of taken up through experience so that we become better players in the game. Does that help? Yeah. Joachim.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. I've got one question that's sort of exegetical with theological consequences potentially, which is what you have in Proverbs 8 is about wisdom being playful, like a child and so forth. Later in the wisdom tradition, for example, in a book that is heavily influenced by Proverbs, the Wisdom of Solomon, you don't have, interestingly, a concept of God playing with his creatures. Also not through wisdom. That's not there. So with a view to the church fathers you talked about, I wonder whether they have applied the concept of the playful wisdom playing near the creator, have taken that out of that very particular context and applied it to the interaction of the deity with his creation, which is a bold exegetical move, which is a bit of a, says another miserable Protestant, a bit of a short circuit, really, that lends to deeply offensive results. Thank you.
Could you say more?
Deeply offensive results with regard to how we as human beings are to receive this concept of being played with by God, which is, to the best of my knowledge, is not a biblical concept, says another miserable Protestant, and I think that is a very important point here. To say this to the sick and the dying is not helpful.
Yeah, to which I'd respond kind of in the way that the Athenian does to the Spartan in the Laws, that is really not what I was getting at with this, or what's being got at with this, that the overarching imagery would be that of a parent with their child, yeah, in which play is a way of bringing up the child, yeah, exercising, playing, learning, all of that, yeah. So it's not we are being played with as we might hear that word, but which is absurd in the way that you just put it, or defective in the way that you spoke about it, but rather as a creature of God, we're learning the ways of God. And as we look at the way that pedagogy works, play is a dynamic of that. Mimesis, integration into a game, however you might want to describe it. So they settled on this verse as a way of expressing that and then took it from there.
Yeah, please.
John, thanks. Maybe we'll end on a friendlier Protestant note. These are great questions. Thank you so much for your talk and everything else. I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about the diversity of this diverse strand that this represents within the Eastern tradition. We were just talking about some other fathers earlier who would not be happy seeing the flux as primitive and that being built up upon, but kind of to Tom's question, wanting to see that as a consequence of the defection from being. Do you think you could come a few bars on that?
So what's striking about Maximus is that he doesn't aim to give a systematic theology. That's not what he's doing. Yeah, and there's no sense in Maximus that is what he should be doing. You know, to elaborate a rigid construction in which everything fits. He's responding to particular questions put to him by Thomas and John about difficult passages, and he's responding to their perplexity by saying, think about it this way, or perhaps think about it this way. If you don't like that, think about it this way. So diversity is absolutely built into that way of doing things as pedagogy again. Yeah, rather than setting up a system which defines and encapsulates and encompasses everything. Okay, and I think that would be pretty true of most of the writers from this kind of period. Especially, I mentioned with Maximus. Maximus really is the first one to start reflecting upon the earlier tradition in doing that. Yeah. Okay.
That's great. Right. Well, thanks very much indeed, everyone. And thank you again, John, for your talk and for the engagement. I'm sure the kind of stimulation which the questions speak of and tell of will have to be shared throughout the room. And we'll look forward to the conversation continuing for the rest of the afternoon. There are a couple of things I have to do now. The first is in addition to saying thank you to John, to express our thanks to Joel Pierce, who's helped to administer and organize the afternoon's events. And the second thing is to invite anyone who wants a photographic record of their involvement in the day's events and indeed your attachment to the department to come and join us down in the quadrangle for a photograph. You don't have to be dressed up, come as you are, and we'll take that photograph down there just immediately following the lecture. So if you could work your way down into the quad as soon as you can, that would be ideal. Josh from the school office is going to come and snap the photograph for us, and so we'll have a record of the day. The third thing is to say that after the photograph is taken, we're going to be able to be in the Divinity library for some refreshments, and you're more than welcome to come and join us there. So thank you very much indeed again, and we'll look forward to seeing you both in the quad and then for some refreshments in the library. Thanks very much. Yes.